I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for a lecture in the series, The Past, Present, and Future of Women's History, which the Wilson Center has been organizing this past year in conjunction with the National Museum of Women's History. And I'm happy to announce that it's going to continue through next fall. So we'll be getting the schedule out for the fall pretty soon. In a moment, I'm going to turn the podium over to Joan Wages, who's president of the National Museum of Women's History, who will tell you more about it. And then I'll introduce today's speaker. But first, let me say a few words about the Wilson Center and its connection to women's history. As a living memorial to President Wilson, the Center is committed to bringing together scholars and policymakers to address a wide range of public issues. Women's rights and gender equality have, of course, been prominent on America's political agenda throughout its history. During Wilson's administration, the question of women's suffrage was front and center, and we're happy to note that it was President Wilson who, with a little urging, shepherded the 19th Amendment through Congress, granting women the vote. This was, of course, a turning point in 20th century U.S. history, and it provided women with a platform from which they were able to launch various forms of activism and greatly expand their role in public life. Today, many of the programs and many of the scholars at the Wilson Center address women's issues, not only in the U.S. but around the world. And we're grateful to the Center for offering us this venue for an important series in women's history. Let me now turn the podium over to Joan Wages, who will tell you about the museum.
Thank you, Sonia. Today was a very interesting day in the history of the museum. I frequently go and speak to groups as far as telling them about the museum, and often starting with, why do we need a National Women's History Museum? So today I got to give that talk to a predominantly male audience for my first time. I was not tomatoed off the stage, so I guess we're doing pretty good. And but it's so important to be able to communicate to people why we need a National Women's History Museum. And it's probably obvious to many here, but women's history is still not in the history textbooks. Only 1 out of 10 figures is of a woman. In the national parks, less than 8% of the statues are of a woman leader. And if you go to our nation's capital right down the street, only 13 of the 214 statues is of a woman. So essentially, women have been left out of the telling of our national story, and that will be our role. And we've already started as telling the story on our website at nwhm.org, but also when we're out speaking. So I am personally looking forward to, and I know all of you are, is to hearing Dr. Brown, who is just one of the premier names in women's history, and hearing her talk about the role of women's history, and I'm looking for pointers as to how I can better tell the story. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. Joan has been just doing spectacular work in making this museum a reality, and we really are very fortunate to have her on this, leading this project. Before I introduce Joan, Kathleen Brown, let me just quickly tell you about the next event in this series, which will be about a month from today, April 18th, and it's going to be Professor Robin Lakoff from the University of California, Berkeley, and her topic is Language Makes History, the intersections of language, gender, and politics. Robin Lakoff is, as probably many of you know, a very important linguist. Her field is linguistics, but she's going to apply her understanding of linguistics to the field of history. So this will be a very interesting and an important lecture, so I hope you can all be here for that. It's really a great honor for me to introduce today's speaker, Kathleen Brown. One of our goals in this series is to enable you all in the Washington area to get to know some of the premier women's historians, not only to find out about the work they do, but to understand how the work they do is really changing the face of U.S. history. And Kathleen Brown is someone whose work has really done this in very important ways. A professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, she's one of today's leading historians of early America. With 2 major award-winning books and numerous articles, she has powerfully made the case that we cannot think about the formation of this country without taking women and gender into consideration. Kathleen Brown's first book, Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs, Gender, Race, and Power in Colonial Virginia, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1996, and it won the Dunning Prize of the American Historical Association for the best book by a junior scholar. In this work, Professor Brown argues that gender served as a meta-language shaping a whole range of social differences, including race and class. She shows that race, class, and gender were not separate, but were overlapping categories that could reinforce and sometimes substitute for one another. But together, by drawing on nature, on the natural order, they served to shape relations between women and men, and especially between white men and African American women. Indeed, sexuality, access to women's bodies, was a central source of power throughout this period of early American history. Although the book focused on colonial Virginia, Professor Brown's provocative analysis has influenced numerous historians working on other parts of early America. One of the important developments in this period of history, Brown indicates in Good Wives, was the shift from divine providence to the human body as the locus of authority. Thus, it's probably not surprising that the human body became the starting point for her most recent book, Foul Bodies, Cleanliness in Early America. And here is a copy of the book, and it's really terrific. I highly recommend it. It's the winner of 2 awards, one from the OAH, the Organization of American Historians, and another from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. The rather modest subtitle of this book, Cleanliness in Early America, is somewhat misleading for a book that covers both the Old World and the New and moves from the colonial era to the mid-19th century, tracing a major shift in perceptions of women's bodies from foul to pristine and addressing topics ranging from bathing, health, and disease to household hygiene and laundry. The book explores the links between whiteness, purity on the one hand, and civilization, gentility, and class on the other, showing how the whitening of people, by which she means many different things, served as a sign of their civilization. At the same time, maintaining cleanliness was, she shows, to a great extent women's work, whether that of housewives or of their servants. Through her focus on cleanliness, Professor Brown gains insights into both intimate and political relationships. On the one hand, she uncovers links between the care of the body and women's fearful, sometimes desperate efforts to protect loved ones from discomfort, disease, and death. While on the other hand, she argues that the emphasis on cleanliness as a sign of civilization was essential to the cultural production of empire in the early modern world. These brief descriptions cannot do justice to the richness and significance of Professor Brown's work, but hopefully they'll give you a foretaste of her unique approach to history. Her research has not only powerfully influenced her colleagues in early American history and in women's history, but they can, I think, serve as an important foundation for the story, or one of the stories, that the National Museum of Women's History will tell. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Brown, who will answer the question, what do sex and laundry have to do with it? Daily life as a source of historical change.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and I credit Sonia for the catchy title. As Sydney will tell you, I came up with several dreadful, boring titles because I was working through a knotty problem in my own head, and I couldn't for the life of me think of anything interesting, and I sort of riffed something to Sonia, and Sonia said, what about that? That'd be a good title. So it's all Sonia. And I do know that this is the less grammatically correct version, but it is more, has greater allusion to the song, What's Love Got to Do with It? I've been out of the country for nearly 2 weeks, and I was dismayed and amazed to catch up with the news about ultrasound wands, wage-earning women's rights to health insurance coverage for contraceptives, lost ovaries, consensual sex as prostitution, sex videos, and nostalgia about time-worn advice to women to hold an aspirin between their knees as a means of maintaining their chastity. Isn't March supposed to be Women's History Month? Is this any way to have a national celebration? Being overseas, it's possible that I missed some of the nuances and thoughtful contemplation of these issues. but it seemed to me that few pundits wanted to be aware of the long history of struggle and controversy behind many of these issues. 4 decades of research and writing about women, gender, and sexuality have yielded mountains of books and articles, as well as new insights into the lives of women and men in the past and the way they experienced their gender and sexuality. In this, the month in which we celebrate International Women's Day and women's history, we are especially grateful for this scholarly output, even if we are painfully aware that it has not been able to save us from recent outbursts of venomous speech about heterosexual women and the relationship of the state to their reproductive capacity. But setting aside that larger elusive goal for the time being, let's focus on putting our own house in order. Have these 4 decades of scholarship transformed the way historians and other students of history understand the processes and dynamics of historical change? If we cannot penetrate, and I use that word deliberately, the analytical apparatus of our fellow historians, how can we hope to have an impact on a larger public? Today I'm going to consider the first of these difficult questions. Difficult because we know what we want the answer to be, and yet we pose the question incessantly precisely because we can't come easily and honestly to that much desired answer. There are still so many signs that women's history has left the central models of imagining historical change unchanged. I'm not here today to provide you with a laundry list of evidence, if you will, that women's history has transformed the way we understand historical change. Sadly, in some of the most publicly influential kinds of history writing, I would argue, models for imagining historical change have altered very little. To understand why this is the case, I'm going to try to come at the question a bit differently by examining how historians imagine the relationship between daily life centered in households, sometimes known as private or domestic life, and the portion of human action that takes place in public, political, or institutional settings, sometimes known as public life. The way historians frame the history they are writing, either as grand synthetic narrative or as more limited case study, has an enormous influence on how they imagine this relationship. To measure and compare these different ways of imagining public and private, I will subject them to what I think of as the sex and laundry test. That is, to see what, if any, role sex and laundry have in particular genres of analysis and how much dynamic power is assigned to them. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? The sex test is really one of accounting and accountability. That every reference by a historian to population growth or a demographic shift needs to be understood to be rooted in countless acts of heterosexual intercourse, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and child rearing, but also to be understood to be part of a wide spectrum of silent sexual activity of all kinds that never appear on the historian's radar. To take one amazing example, the fact that half of all residents of the British North American colonies were under the age of 16 at the time of the American Revolution is often mentioned in passing by historians without really subjecting it to the sex test. By laundry test, I'm making a shortcut reference to my own work on the history of the body. It was common practice in the 17th and 18th century English-speaking world to clean the body by changing undergarments, known as shirts, and bed linens, rather than by bathing. Laundry was thus connected to civility and health. I'm also referring, when I say laundry test, to the significance culturally and economically of textiles in the British trade with North America in the 18th century. Finally, it is also important to recognize the gradual movement of laundry from being a hated chore performed by women who were itinerant and suspiciously sexually autonomous in 16th and 17th century England, to being a still hated but completely domesticated task by the 19th century in the United States. Let me begin by sharing my own effort to imagine this relationship. My work on the histories of slavery, the body, and more recently, the history of human rights have convinced me that daily life has a public and a private face, to different degrees for different people. Yet everything that takes place in private life does so inflected with the purpose and meaning of what goes on in public and political spaces. We learn to groom our appearance, our manners, our personalities with the normative expectations of public life in mind. Likewise, everything that takes place in public life is the accumulation of actions by individuals who have made the transition from the backstage of private life to the center stage of their lives in public. Spectacle and shocking performances that deliberately confound this normative division. One thinks of talk show confrontations, people who purposefully engage in sex for public viewing without monetary remuneration, and the seemingly endless desire to share mundane details of so-called private life on social networks have all become boundary-crossing genres in their own right and a bit ordinary as a result. That is all well and good, but analyzing this relationship between private and public and rooting a historical narrative in that analysis requires that we dig a bit deeper. My own interest in digging deeper comes from my recent efforts to participate with two other authors in writing a new American history textbook that recenters the American history narrative in a global context. It is this current task that inspires much of what I have to say today. But I also bring to bear on this my recent stint as president of the Berkshire Conference and over 20 years in college classrooms teaching courses on women, race, gender, sexuality, and disorderly and marginal people. It might be well to make a confession. I spend a lot of time thinking about sex and laundry, alone, together, and in relation to each other. And that is just in real life. As a historian, I do much the same. Perhaps this makes me just like all other historians, or other middle-aged women, or other mothers, or other type A personalities. If I stand apart from this group, it's not for my belief that sex and laundry, among other activities that often occur in households, are suitable material for historical analysis. A host of distinguished scholars, both older and younger than myself, some of whom are here today, share that belief and have provided essential studies of clothing and fashion, motherhood, housework, birth control, and sexuality. Building on this foundation, what I want us to consider today are the possibilities of imagining all of these daily household activities as overlooked and poorly understood sources of historical change in their own right. What goes on in the household, in other words, most definitely does not stay in the household, but even when it seems to do so, it might still be the mainspring of historical change. So for our purposes today, I want to frame this discussion around three models for the relationship between public and private commonly found in historical writing. The first one is the public-driven model. The first model, in which private life plays a bit part, if any, appears in the grand narrative of textbooks and synthetic comparative and transnational studies. In these meta-narratives, the details of private life are of almost no importance to the analysis. The accounts themselves might include details about women, consumer habits, manliness, or population shifts, but these adorn rather than drive the narrative. Some of these narratives lack even the most rudimentary gesture towards including women, gender, or sexuality. There are several recent synthetic works in Atlantic history, which is one of the fields I consider my own, that fall into this category. Using my litmus test of sex and laundry, these meta-narratives focus on revolutions, nation-making, wars, markets, and empires, without any comment on how the reproduction of populations of historical actors through reproductive heterosexual intercourse, or their daily reproduction of their public selves through laundry, healthcare, and manners takes place. I am not an unsympathetic critic of this model. I am rapidly becoming acquainted with this mode of historical writing in my forays as a textbook co-author. Page limits and the need for coverage of canonical events and people creates the pressure to stick to the event-centered histories of public life and politics. In the second model, public and private are dynamically linked as if in a circuit that flows in both directions. People's private decisions create forces or pressures that have public outcomes, and major public events force transformations in people's daily lives. Drew Faust's Republic of Suffering and Jim Downs' forthcoming Sick from Freedom are good examples of this kind of historical writing in which the accumulation of individual responses to enormous changes provokes change in governing authorities and policy. Historians like Faust and Downs have been most successful capturing the dynamic flow in smaller case studies. It is more difficult to do this in textbooks or grand narratives. Usually, however, even in these smaller studies, we imagine the public leaving its imprint on the private more so than the other way around. When historians invoke Bourdieu's concept of habitus, for example, they often define it as society's imprint on the body and mind of the individual. For example, as capitalism reorganizes labor and capital, it shifts social relations, placing more emphasis on stimulating the body's constitution for participation in labor and markets, and allowing greater numbers of people entree into civil society and political life, which in turn produces concerns about overstimulation. In late 18th century Germany, in 19th century Russia, in the 19th century United States, fears of being overstimulated, of being too highly sexed, of being seduced by marketplaces of ideas and goods, and of the baneful health consequences of mixing across social divides, resulted in efforts to combat this overstimulation, with warnings about masturbation and new regimes for grooming and health care. More difficult for the historian is to show both the plasticity of bodies and minds so imprinted by society and their capacity still to make history on a grand scale, including the histories of war, nation, empire, and global commerce. The third model is an important exercise in historical imagination, even if in its most radical form it goes further than many of us find useful for our writing. And I should say, I haven't tried it in my writing, really. I gave it a little bit of a shot in the last book, but I'm not going to go out on a limb and say, I've done it, so everybody else should do it. But I actually think it's very valuable to think about it. It would imagine historical change as a constant process of emergence, rather than of direction or action that can be captured with narrative clarity. Change, according to this model, is messy and chaotic. It is the result of many individuals and households making independent decisions that do not conform easily to the clear lines of economic theory, religious theology, law, state authority, empire, racial divides, or even normative expectations for gender and sex. This is a world of blurred lines, where the rules and discourses of public life get compromised in their application. It is a world in which women especially, but also gay and transgender people, people of color, and some men live without the luxury of the clear lines laid out by public authorities and in public debate. This is a world of smudged lines, or as Anna Clark has put it in her survey of centuries of European sexuality, twilight moments. One has only to think about the panel of religious experts recently convened to discuss the relationship between government policy and religious belief to be painfully aware that only some people have been privileged to live life in the seamless world of clear lines, where there is no inherent misfit between one's identity, desires, and needs, and the formal rules of law, religion, human rights, and healthcare. In its most radical incarnation, this third model is nihilistic about the need for a public or political payoff to a history of domestic life. It would assert that there is some value simply in inverting our assumed analytical priorities and narrating, to take one example, the changing circumstances of women's role in the shift from the coercive, state-sponsored regime of punishment as public spectacle, in other words, off with their heads, to the bourgeois family as a place where people are inculcated with normative values about sex, race, the body, manners, and appearance. Are we even able to depart from our implicit physics-based models of historical change in which, despite all our sophistication, we revert to imagining central dynamic nodes producing radiating circular waves of change, much like the ripples produced when one drops a stone in the water? How can we even imagine a world in which the rippling waves might all begin in some messy outer ring and ripple in toward the center? Even worse, if we can imagine historical change as an emergent process of multiple, dispersed, independent actions, is it possible to write about it in a coherent way? Having taken this dive into the metaphysics of imagining historical change and writing historical narratives, I want to spend the rest of my time speaking in more concrete terms about some specific cases in which reimagining historical causes and consequences to give more agency to households and domestic life changes our understanding of the past. My examples come from 3 episodes in Atlantic history, a process known as creolization in the Americas, the role of the household in Britain's empire in North America, and this third one will be optional depending on my time, the transatlantic abolition movement, the first campaign for human rights. Creolization is a term that historians use in many different ways. Yet in all its meanings, the specificity of women's roles as biological and cultural reproducers is occluded. Until recently, the rise of Creole populations, meaning the reproduction of European or African populations in the Americas, was sometimes referred to as natural increase. Jennifer Morgan's study of enslaved women's childbearing disabused us of the notion that there was anything natural about the rise of a Creole slave population, but we might well extend that analysis to all populations. As Angus McLaren's stunning study of reproductive ritual showed long ago, there's nothing natural about reproduction for anyone, especially not for the enslaved. Creolization also has cultural meanings when it is used to describe the creation of new cultures out of the old in the Americas. Historians frequently use this term to describe Euro-Americans or African Americans moving culturally as well as geographically from their old worlds, often with a partial acknowledgement of the influence of Native Americans on the new cultural formations. It might be just as useful to describe Native Americans as Creoles in their efforts to adapt to the presence of Europeans. Native Americans who met Europeans halfway as military allies, diplomatic interlocutors, as partners in trade, as people who began to share an aesthetic of shirts and stockings and jackets. All of this suggests that the middle ground, which is a term used by a very well-known, very brilliant historian of Native America, might well be simply the concurrent and codependent rise of European and Indian Creole cultures. When creolization is referred to as a force or condition of historical change, a source of political conflict with old Europe, as a new generation of native-born people of English descent arises in the Americas, or the new tactics adopted by slaves for dealing with or resisting slavery, that is to say, native-born enslaved people who have certain advantages over their forebears who were forcibly transported from Africa. When creolization is then invoked as part of the narrative of historical change, the gender and sex usually disappear, along with significant portions of the cultural context. Let's take the case of interracial relationships. Such relationships were an important factor in early creolization everywhere in the Americas, and they were always asymmetrical. Many more indigenous women partnered with or succumbed to colonizing European men than the other way around. Women's quite specific roles as carriers of culture as well as of children gets lost when we use creolization unmoored from the particular gender asymmetry in which it occurred. Anne Hyde's new book, Empires, Nations, and Families, and Bethel Saylor's forthcoming book are good antidotes to this generic rather than gender and sex-specific use of creolization. Both books feature complicated multi-ethnic and racial families helping to create regional cultures in their efforts to sustain their own households. Adopting this more mindful use of creolization, in which it is a strategy as well as a process, we can begin to see racial conflicts in other historical epochs in a different light. The post-Reconstruction backlash against interracial sex and marriage in the American South, so beautifully analyzed by Peggy Pasco, might appear as resistance to new manifestations of creolization between populations of white people and former slaves and immigrants. Transnationally and comparatively, we might see Ann Stoller's studies of the intimate relations of empire as arising out of the consequences and efforts to stem the tide of creolization in colonized places. Seen in this light, creolization is less a natural consequence of peoples in contact through colonization, but a particular reaction to how they loved or coerced people into sex, how they organized domestic labor to meet standards of civilized dress and appearance, care for the ill, what language they spoke, and how these reactions left an imprint on a new generation of children, usually the progeny of indigenous women. It thus becomes a source of historical change rather than simply a neutral event or a byproduct of other events. Britain's presence in North America as a settler society began a unique imperial trajectory. From the start, most of its mainland colonies were imagined to be permanent settlements of Anglo households rather than trade outposts or plantation societies run by absentee landlords. The pattern laid by settlement was striking, both for Britain's ability to dominate North America and fend off its imperial rivals, first the Dutch, then the Spanish and the French, and for the North American colonies eventually to muster an independence movement. Neither the British trade outposts under the authority of the Hudson Bay Company, one of the few North American examples of sustained British engagement with Indigenous women and production of Métis children, nor the British plantation islands of the Caribbean would follow their North American colonist counterparts down the revolutionary path. More so than their French, Dutch, Spanish, or Portuguese counterparts, the British were really good at establishing households. And once they got past the wars with indigenous peoples, the malaria and the fever and ague, really good at reproducing prolifically. They also welcomed family migrations of European religious dissidents into the British colonies, at least at first. By 1751, when Benjamin Franklin wrote his essay on the expanding Anglo-American population, the residents of the British mainland colonies were reproducing at an unprecedented rate and consuming British goods nearly as indulgently. By the time of the American Revolution, 50% of colonial North American residents were under the age of 16. The reproducing Anglo-American household appeared relentless to Native Americans, who discovered to their horror that it could not be bounded by colonial law, imperial treaty, or even the threat of terror. Anglo-American households expanded relentlessly west beyond negotiated treaty lines, where they gave formerly Indian-dominated areas a new emergent character manifested in the rough justice of local householders. Often in ways that seemed to fly in the face of imperial authorities seeking to contain the violence that disrupted trade and cost too much to put down, Anglo-American householders followed their own desires for more land and resources. This was especially true in regions that became overhunted for furs and began to shift over to agriculture, marked by the arrival of homesteaders and their families determined to impose their possession of the land. For 2 centuries, Europeans shifted alliances with each other and with Native Americans in an effort to control the flow of goods across the ocean and into the hands of Native and European settler consumers. In the 17th century, the Dutch fought with the Spanish, Portuguese, and English for a place in the Atlantic commercial world that was increasingly organized along imperial and mercantile lines. By the early 18th century, Britain, France, and Spain were the main combatants, competing to woo Native American allies, quash incipient slave rebellions, and curtail the spread of their rivals into Indian country, the vast lands west of what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Britain's advantage in this rivalry was twofold. They offered their native allies a greater range of affordable and desirable trade goods, and they vastly outnumbered both native peoples and their European enemies on the North American continent. Indeed, the efficient reproduction and geographic spread of the Anglo-American household from the East Coast west toward the Mississippi Valley may have been the most important weapon in the British imperial arsenal. Even after the British defeated the French in 1763 and seized control of key North American trading posts and waterways, North America continued to be a site of imperial rivalry as the Spanish and the French tried to maintain footholds in the region they still aspired to control. This process continued to play out after American victory over Britain in the Revolutionary War and its establishment as an independent nation. In addition to the British presence, Spain and France remained a threat to the sovereignty of the new nation. Spain still controlled a vast area in Florida that extended west through present-day Georgia and Louisiana to their Mexican territories. The French still held the all-important port city of New Orleans, gateway to the Mississippi River, and the lands around the Gulf of Mexico. Offers of assistance from the French, British, and Spanish kept alive Indian hopes of pushing back white American frontier dwellers. Indian leaders like the Creek chief Alexander McGillivray son of a Scotsman and a French Creek woman, attempted again to form alliances among Creeks and Muskogee Indians that might protect Indian territory in present-day western Florida, Georgia, and Alabama from American incursions. Although the repeated betrayals of treaty promises and the haughty manner of the Americans drove Indians into the arms of the Europeans, the most grating fact for Indians was continued encroachments by white settlers. These householders, who staked out land and established households without regard for the formal legal restraints on their westward migration, were also the greatest reason for U.S. expansion. Native Americans resisted encroachments on their land in the Ohio Territory with some initial sustained success in what historians know today as the Northwest Indian War, 1785 to 1795. Bitter complaints by frontier dwellers about their vulnerability to Indian predations and demands for protection led the U.S. Army to attempt two unsuccessful reprisals in 1790 and 1791. The third effort, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August 1794, succeeded. Under the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, the U.S. gained new territory in what is now Ohio and Indiana and temporarily drove the British out of their forts. White American settlers eagerly pushed west into these new lands, thus beginning anew the cycle of Indian-white skirmishes over land and resources. Daniel Boone and his wife Rebecca Bryan Boone were just two of the thousands of white householders whose movements west generated new pressures on tense relations with neighboring Indians. Pushing west, regardless of the legality of their actions, under the inequitable treaties between Indians and European imperial powers and the U.S. government, their on-the-ground presence shaped policies generated in the far-off venues of diplomatic and military power. Boone, raised a Quaker, grew up in rural North Carolina, where he met the Quaker Bryan family. After his marriage to Rebecca, Boone would set off on his own for months to hunt deer and beaver deep in Indian territory. He followed his own desires to explore and claim land not yet held by white Americans. But in so doing, he also pushed the western boundaries of white migration and settlement. He also served as a guide to white people who wished to establish themselves in the new frontier lands. But as much as Daniel Boone's role as the intrepid deerskin-clad hunter, explorer, Indian fighter, and guide have been celebrated in literature and song, it was probably his wife's efforts in setting up 4 successive frontier households in North Carolina, Kentucky, Virginia, and finally in Spanish Upper Louisiana, later Missouri, and bearing 10 children. That was a more crucial factor in holding onto U.S. territory and undermining the power of both Indians and European empires. The combination of land speculation and settlement that the Boones together represented resulted in new territories quickly becoming new states: Kentucky in 1792, Tennessee in 1796, and Ohio in 1803. The demand for Virginia's slaves in Louisiana was also a consequence of imperial jockeying and new streams of white American migration to the area, which, unlike the Indiana Territory in the Ohio River Valley, was open to slaveholding. And this, just because I'm actually a little bored with this narrative, I'm fine on time, so don't get worried about that, but I just want to skip to the punchline here. Basically, the Louisiana Territory changed hands several times, and it goes back to France, to Napoleon, who hopes that with Louisiana he might have a chance to regain Canada and extend his reach across North America. He also saw the control of the Mississippi and the port of New Orleans as crucial for supplying Saint-Domingue, which was not yet Haiti, which was still in French hands. There was a treaty which returned Louisiana to France for the first time. And then was followed by another treaty in which Spain transferred western Florida to the U.S., gave Americans access to the Mississippi River, and reopened immigration to Americans. So the punchline that I'm dying to get to here is that Spain had tried during the 1760s several efforts to secure the upper Louisiana Territory. First, they tried to transplant Catholic Acadian refugees who had been basically ethnically cleansed out of Nova Scotia by the British. but they couldn't get enough of them, and they couldn't really make them stick. Then they tried making deals with Shawnee and Delaware Indian refugees who had been displaced by that very set of wars in the Ohio River Valley that resulted in the Treaty of Greenville. Again, they didn't end up with the kind of household settlement that really enabled them to secure the area. So their next move is the one that still blows my mind. They actually made an offer to Americans, disgruntled Americans, who felt that the government wasn't doing enough to secure their land titles, and hoped that they could pry them away from their newly formed national loyalties and get them to move and settle permanently in family households in the upper Louisiana territory as residents of the Spanish Empire. And Spanish Governor Trudeau specifically mentioned the value to the Spanish colony of an ample supply of American families. And in doing so, he acknowledged really the argument I'm trying to make here, which is it's these family households that really do the work of empire, even though they're doing their own work. The most amazing thing to me is that among the families who took the Spanish up on their offer is none other than Daniel Boone and two of his sons. Boone took the Spanish offer in an effort to recoup debts incurred from failed efforts to claim title to his own land and to act as agent for other Western migrants. In other words, he was involved in some speculations which didn't pay off either for himself or the people he was sort of leading down the primrose path. He and his family relocated to Femme Osage on the Spanish western side of the Mississippi in the upper Louisiana colony that would ultimately become Missouri. He and the other American settlers there were there permanently to farm and hunt, not just to engage in trade. And this is what the Spanish were looking for to secure their still hopeful imperial claims against what was clearly working so well for the United States. The U.S. continued this form of settler colonialism during the first 60 years of nationhood. National expansion occurred through the possession and the settlement of territories under the Old Northwest Ordinance and the Louisiana Purchase. The often unsanctioned presence of white householders had everything to do with why imperial and the national forces eventually triumphed over native peoples, and why the United States eventually took possession of the entire midsection of the North American continent. Oh, went the wrong way. Okay, so we do have time for my third example. This actually comes from work I'm doing right now on thinking about transatlantic abolition as the first campaign for human rights. Is it sort of flickering there? Oh, hold on, I moved it, that's why. There we go. So this example offers us a view of what one historian has called the private life of empires as a historical force, in which the propriety of emotional expression, the desire for moral capital, to use a phrase that historian Christopher Brown has used, the need to find suitable objects for empathy, that all of these things can recast the philosophical and intellectual ground upon which they emerge. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about two Enlightenment figures who we don't often think of together, but we should, because she was the first reviewer of his narrative, Mary Wollstonecraft and Olaudah Equiano. Wollstonecraft we know as the author of two important treatises on human rights, the first on the rights of man, the second on the rights of woman. Before she wrote the treatise on the rights of women, the vindication of the rights of women, she reviewed a narrative written by a fellow who went by the pen name Olaudah Equiano. His real name appears to have been Gustavus Vasa. And there is still some pretty lively debate about whether he was an African-born enslaved person, as he claimed in his memoir, or whether he was really kind of a clever Benjamin Franklin-esque self-inventor who was born in South Carolina, perhaps in slavery, and then seized his main chance to write a narrative of his life and the Middle Passage and all of his adventures in the Atlantic. In any case, I start with them because in both cases they drew very much on Enlightenment traditions, but they both had a very interesting impulse, especially when we look at what comes later. They both wrote a lot about gender and sex in their own ways, but they both saw some danger in being denied certain of the qualities that were sort of characteristically denied to people of their group. So, for example, Wollstonecraft placed a lot of emphasis on motherhood, but she also made a strong argument for women's capacity for reason. And even though she had read Equiano's narrative, which was an abolitionist tract denouncing slavery in the form of an autobiographical account of the horrors of his own experience, even though she'd read it, and she'd read about accounts of the suffering of female slaves in the Atlantic, her own vindication of the rights of women had almost nothing to say about female slaves in the Americas, about African women enslaved. She did write about slaves. She wrote about the slaves of Eastern harems. That's her model for slavery. That's who she was most concerned about. And there are interesting reasons why. One of them has to do with the fact that her real fear about being a woman was of being, or of women, for women generally, the fate of women generally, was of being too gendered, like the women of the harem, too secluded, too overly feminized, and rendered useless and ornamental. And so those were the foils for her, much as the aristocratic women of England were the foils for her account in Vindication of the Rights of Women. The group of women who would arguably have made the sort of greatest poster child for women wronged would have been these women in slavery around the Atlantic. She had almost nothing to say about them. When she reviewed Equiano's piece, she did make note of what he had to say about those enslaved women. So she knew about them, but strategically she didn't write about them in the Vindication. So her fear is of women either because they want to imitate aristocratic ladies or because they're going to end up being imprisoned in a harem-like existence as ornaments, are at risk of being too gendered. Now, Equiano, for his part, is dealing with the caricature of enslaved men as brutish primitives with no feeling at all. So he, in his narrative, goes out of his way to make note of the fact when a loud noise makes him feel faint, to really highlight the fact that he is a man full of feeling, of the most refined feeling. Wollstonecraft says in the Vindication, a group of people who she sees as, coarse individuals who lack sensibility, and she mentions sailors, but slaves certainly would be in that group as well. Equiano's really trying very hard to be a very refined man of great sensibility. He portrays himself that way, dresses that way when he's depicted in a portrait, and his autobiography is of a man of feeling. And the argument really is, if an enslaved man can feel this much, how can you possibly justify enslaving him? Because clearly he is a human like you. So with that beginning, both of them sort of rejecting the dangers, the pitfalls of being sort of falling into their own caricatures, if you will. It's interesting to then look a generation later at what happens to the abolitionist sentiment and to the argument. What's interesting is that although the tradition of continuing to argue for a gender-transcendent human rights persists and even becomes louder briefly during the 1830s in the United States, when abolitionist women are being argued off the abolitionist platform by men who are uncomfortable with them, with their presence, with their public speaking. At that point, there are lots of proclamations about human rights. What is good for a man is also good for a woman. But generally, that strand of human rights thinking begins to be submerged, and the one which becomes more pronounced is a tactical one. How can white people get other white people to expand their notion of the category of human so that they can see enslaved people as fellow humans? Well, there are a set of beautiful emblems. The first one is of a man, a very cowering, manacled, pathetic-looking enslaved man, and the caption reads, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And that was a sort of generic sign of the abolitionist cause. Abolitionist women come out with their own version, so they end up with his and hers medallions, and it's, again, of a manacled and kneeling woman, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" And at that point, the strategy of abolitionists departs radically from the kind of human rights tradition that Equiano and Wollstonecraft come out of. And it really makes appeals that we would now see as so saturated with gender that the transcendent human almost disappears. And there are a couple reasons for this. Lots of people have written about it, but one of the fascinating things, I think, which gets back to my sex test question, has to do with the difficult position of abolitionists, white abolitionist women. Black abolitionist women are also in a difficult position for different reasons. White abolitionist women are always risking their propriety, but they certainly can't stand up in front of audiences or write too passionately about their feeling for the enslavement of enslaved men. And this has to do with long standing taboos on interracial sex, but it also has to do with the long history of the depiction of slavery in relationship to white womanhood. If you look at the history of portraits in England and in the United States where enslaved people appear, usually as shadowy figures in the background, you never see a woman of childbearing age with a buff adult black man, unless he's in livery or he's in manacles. The figure presented with adult women of childbearing age, white women, are children or other women. That taboo on the proximity of white womanhood and fully adult, fully embodied black masculinity extended to portraiture. And it certainly made the appeal by abolitionist women based on the suffering of enslaved women a much easier one to make. They could hold on to their propriety. They could claim fellow feeling. They could invoke their own knowledge and beliefs and deep feelings about motherhood, about the unnaturalness of severing the bond between mother and child, which they often talked about as being very similar to the union of husband and wife being one flesh. They use those same metaphors to describe the separation of enslaved mothers and their children. So just as a final point in this example, three interesting views of marriage emerge during this generation of abolitionist activism. The first is a critique shared by a small number of white women and some African American abolitionist activists that marriage actually isn't so great for women's human rights, except when they look south. And then they're not so sure, because marriage does seem to offer enslaved women certain protections and benefits that they currently lack as slaves. And this becomes a pretty difficult question, and people are all over it. Amy Drew Stanley has written about this very effectively, and I'm almost convinced by her, except I find that what the African American women say is so cautious that I'm not quite convinced. She argues that they really seem to understand that the marriage contract really is a problem even for enslaved women. I'm not quite so sure I'm seeing that even in their writings. If anybody understands it, they do. But a lot of white women abolitionists definitely don't see it. And so marriage gets described by abolitionists as a positive remedy for enslavement in the South, but mainly from the perspective of enslaved men, because it would allow them to assume full manly privilege and full manly authority. And then they are a little bit quiet about what that would mean for enslaved women. So we end up with, again, a set of kind of difficult dilemmas that nobody really speaks to directly, but that are out there kind of, the phrase I used before, emergent, with lots of possibilities for how they can be worked out. Okay, and now I am at the end of my time, so I want to try to wrap this up. My hope in this talk today, which I will tell you I wrote especially for you, this is not a recycled talk, this is me struggling and thinking out loud based on things I'm working on right now, was to try to raise our own awareness, but to also sharpen my own thinking about these issues, about our models of social reality, about the links between the state, politics, public, and private life, so that private life is not always dependent and subordinate. I do think that analytically, as long as private life is dependent and subordinate, we won't achieve the full potential of what women's history always hoped it would achieve. I want us to also think, and I continue to think about how to imagine historical change, whether we think of it as cause and effect, as circuitry, as emergence, as something much more diffuse that's much harder to write about, as capillaries. There are all kinds of models out there, but being really aware of what model you use and what the impact of that model will have on who gets privileged in your story is very important. And then finally, thinking about the models for narrating historical change, how we tell the story, whether we're aiming for that grand master narrative, and I do mean, unfortunately, master narrative in many cases, and for whom we are writing. And what I would say is we've been most successful in that mid-range of writing, where we take a very specific study, we do explore linkages. We've been least successful in this last category, or actually I guess it's the first category, the big meta-narratives. That's where what Joan was saying about, the textbook statistics are still quite depressing, but I would say even worse than that. Women, people of color, and certainly anybody who's not a heterosexual are token adornments even when they appear in those texts. They are not drivers of the narrative. So what I'm suggesting is something that requires a much deeper rethinking. It's likely to drive me crazy as I try to work on this textbook I'm working at. I know I'm going to drive my fellow authors crazy. I'm kind of looking forward to that part. But there's a big issue here, and it's not a simple one of adding a few more women, because that's not going to change the narrative. That's actually not going to change the mechanisms that explain how historical change happens. And I'm happy to take your questions on any or all of this. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I want to tell a quick story. My name is Leanne Irwin, and I'm here by myself. The Women's Encampment for a Future of Peace and Justice in upstate New York, which was opposing military weapons, nuclear weapons, we found out that the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, we knew about that, and we went to find the plaque, and the plaque was covered up, and it was in a laundromat. So we had a little action. We dressed up as cleaning ladies, and we cleaned the historical sign. Now there's a National Historic Park there, but I thought you would enjoy that story.
I mean, I love it, but I hate it.
And the second thing is, I don't know the name of the book, but I'm reading a book about this transatlantic abolitionist women's response to abolition, and I read that British women chose a boycott of sugar as a means to support, to oppose abolition. And it seems as a strategy they didn't do textiles or cotton, because that would have really confronted the whole economic system, where sugar they could kind of abstain but still be effective. So that was really exciting to me.
Right.
If you know about other things like that, I'd be interested.
Yeah. American women also, some American abolitionist women engaged in boycotts, and what they would do is describe the sourcing of the products as free sugar, free cotton, and clearly there were gradations of strictness and how they abided by that. Yes.
Hi, my name is Junior Bridge, and I'm here not as a representative of the agency I work for, but out of curiosity, from a historical perspective, how do you explain the slamming of women by the Republican presidential candidates? And more importantly, their supporters.
Well, I suspect we could all put our brains together on that one and still not come up with a very good answer. And I would just say that I have seen in a number of venues, and I guess I want to be careful how I say this, I've seen in a number of venues, and I'll speak about the one I know the best, which is a small, insignificant sector compared to the question you've asked. But even in academia, there has been a bit of a backlash, which has appeared in the form of documentably lower achievement of tenure for women who take maternity leave. So that's, again, that's like a tiny little response to you, but what I would say is cultural history, history of ideas and beliefs, the old ones that may seem to be changed by political achievements never go away. They just get layered over, and they can always bubble up to the surface. In any kind of large public debate, on rhetoric on both sides, if you look carefully, you're hearing a lot of sediment from a lot of older debate and argument. And so I'm not surprised. As a historian, I'm not surprised. I never look to the past and feel safe, ever. And can I just say, I'm a very privileged heterosexual white woman. And I don't think the past is a very safe place to wander in if you want to feel safe about where you are in the present. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I feel very privileged. I am aware of my privilege. So I'm ducking part of the answer, I think, out of the desire to be diplomatic in this audience. I don't know very well, but I've certainly lost some sleep over it, and I can't give you an easy answer.
Sorry. Eric Arneson from the Woodrow Wilson Center and GW. Two quick questions. The first has to do with your optimism or lack of optimism about textbooks and the project that you're proposing. Given the obstacles that you laid out, it strikes me that you may just be doomed, that you cannot do in the format of the textbook what it is that you want to do, that the pressures will simply be far too great to conform to the current models, and that sales will govern everything, and the older model will ultimately prevail. Second, and perhaps more historical in nature, take your second example about families moving west as agents of empire and colonization. I'm trying to square your kind of programmatic statements with the actual example, because the actual example strikes me as, and I'm not a historian of this period at all, as familiar. I recognize it. I mean, I've read some of your work, so maybe this is where it comes from, but it strikes me that if you replace the word Americans moved westward and were agents of expansion, and they came into conflict with Native Americans, and you added families in its place, okay, that's more accurate, but it doesn't fundamentally transform the picture that you suggest needs to be transformed. Right. So the example doesn't actually achieve for me in the telling what you're proposing. If you could just address that, yep. I would appreciate.
Right. Eric Arneson, a fine historian whose work I have read and learned from. I wouldn't, first of all, I would say I don't see I'm not proposing changing the word Americans move westward, changing the term and just saying American families. I'm actually really interested in the household. The household is sometimes a family, not always a family. Sometimes it's more than a family, but it's also an economic unit and a social unit and really a political unit, because heads of households have special privileges and are recognized specially. It is the one place I can think of where I can connect all the work that the people who don't appear in textbooks do with the work that the people who do appear in textbooks do. That's sort of the little bit of common ground. Now, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think actually in some ways the least original payoff on thinking about the household is to think about sort of the 19th century westward expansion. Although I do find the whole thing about the Spanish trying to recruit some good American families, I still think that's the wildest story I've ever heard. Where it does do something different for me, and I would also say I don't know what I'm doing in the 19th century, really. I kind of wandered in there by accident, and there I am. So I'm not claiming, full expertise on that either. What it does do for me is it actually helps me understand why first the British dominate North America and then the Americans do, better than any other explanation I have. And that's after spending 20 years thinking about it. So when I put together Benjamin Franklin's thoughts about the expanding Anglo-American population and endless repetitious accounts, almost interchangeable accounts of white settlers pissing off Native Americans by ignoring the rules and just crossing the lines they're not supposed to cross again and again and again and again. And what Native Americans are willing to do to try to push that back, it just begins to make a lot more sense to me. And it gives me a way of finding a historical perspective where I can look up to the big guys, the big decision makers, and I can look in to the seemingly behind the scenes work that produces all those people in those frontier settings. So that's where one of the big payoffs is for me. Now I'm trying to convince the 20th century person in my textbook project that it is also a value for him to think about changes in the kind of legal protection of private life, of consumer culture, that still has an analytic value for him and a way for him to connect the big story with, the story of what we think of as popular culture, maybe, or the history of the family, or the history even of the American home. So I agree with you, but I'm still hopeful. Now, about it being doomed, in a way that just gets me all revved up. I do think it's doomed, but I also think it's worth. I'm sort of gung ho about this household thing.
Oh, this is Sonia Michelle. This is a kind of a related question. If you were going to have your druthers and you were going to write the history of the United States from the perspective of the household, what would the periodization look like? Would it be different?
Well, that's a great question. I haven't really, because I'm still at the beginning of trying to convince my co-authors about this. This is great though, because I can really think out loud and maybe present it to them that way, do some of the work for them. Well, first of all, I'd say the first thing that comes to mind is really wonderful work looking at plantation households and thinking about slaves as part of economic units, even if they did not see themselves as part of white families the way white people like to talk about them. And certainly, I don't know, yet would the periodization be different? I think I guess I would say a tentative yes. Susan Klepp has a book about the decline in the fertility of white American families, which begins much earlier than we thought, 1780s in certain families, and continues almost unbroken until, well, almost to the 1980s. But the big drop is from 1800 to 1900, where completed family size goes from 7 children to 3.5 children. I would probably reperiodize some of this based on household size and production of children, and so I would end up with something that looks a little bit different. But I don't know. It's a great question, and that'll keep me thinking on my train ride back. But that's exactly the way it has to go to make a difference.
Jim Lowen, I wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me, which critiques textbooks, so I'm really looking forward to yours. And I don't think it's a doomed enterprise at all. I think the publishers are paper tigers, and most of the authors don't put much, they don't even write their books. And it sounds like you're writing yours and putting a lot of intellectual energy into it, and so more power to you, and I'm looking forward to it. One other comment, the Mexicans did exactly the same thing a generation later, of course, in Texas, in terms of inviting in American households. And then they found that little rascals were American rather than Mexican.
Right.
And this messed them up. But I have a question, and that is, I particularly know about the formation of legal families among African Americans during and after the Civil War in Mississippi. I don't see a whole lot of what you were talking about, this, like, for instance, gender-related reluctance on the part of black women to enter into these families.
No.
Just a comment.
No, and I would not disagree with you. The people I'm talking about are a pretty small group of Northern African American spokespeople. It's too early to use the word, race woman, but really they're activists on behalf of African Americans, and this is really leaning on the work of Amy Drew Stanley. One of the things she argues at is that when abolitionists women focus so heavily on the suffering of enslaved women as the prototype of the violation of human rights, they open up the Pandora's box. And people have to really work hard to close it back down, because in fact it almost sounds to many African American women especially like they're saying African American women should be completely free, even of those constraints of the marriage contract. Now, as I said, Stanley makes that argument a little bit more strongly than I would probably, because I see what they say as a bit more equivocal, but I think it's a very interesting point. So it's not the women on the ground who actually are having a chance to marry and see benefits in marriage in the South. It's folks who are thinking about emancipation, marriage, human rights, free labor, in a very different context. So I don't disagree with you at all on that.
My name is Joan Domingo, and I have going back to your textbook again, what is the level of the textbook that you're working on? And in an ideal world, what would you like to see in it? And because there are always constraints on length, what would you take out of the textbook? I'm a retired middle school teacher. In our history textbook, it included women and included various minorities, but in many cases you almost felt as though they were there so they could, the publisher could tick off and say, okay, well we've added these many women, we've added this many Hispanics, we've added this many Native Americans, and trying to get enough in there to kind of make everybody happy. But I would be curious what,
right.
And in an ideal world, and then what you would remove.
Well, this is the question. So I'll just tell you very honestly, I'm in the middle of, we each have 8 chapters to write. This is destined for an introductory college level class. We each have 8 chapters to write. In the new textbook market, textbooks have to be much shorter. Bad news. But good news in another way. And the other problem, and this goes back to Eric's comment about being doomed, they really want to be sure that you're including the stuff that's in all the other textbooks. So when you write something that looks a little bit different, they want to, I'm getting back from my co-authors, oh, you didn't say enough about Jefferson. and the Embargo Act. Well, I did say something about Jefferson and the Embargo Act. Well, anyway, okay, so that's a long digression. But what I found to my horror when I did the first draft of the textbook chapter, you would never know I was a women's historian. I was horrified. And I just thought, I could be anyone. What difference do I make? So then I started trying to hammer away at myself and wrestle with this problem. So the answer is, I don't know. I'm going to have to just keep bashing away at it and trying to find devices. Like my section is called Empires. So finding a way to have the household tell the story of empires. And just to go back to Eric's point, I don't see them as sort of dupes of empire. They're following their own agendas. And they often run afoul of empires, but in the end, it still manages to work out for the empire pretty well. The British Empire, anyway. Really ruins things for the French and the Spanish. So I'm going to have to be creative. Now, since I only have to do 8 chapters, it may be that I can work with the household and empires and find a way to mention the stuff, to treat the canonical stuff as the checklist and to put in the stuff I want to put in. I'm not there yet. It's really hard. So when I was saying that stuff about these big narratives not including women, I'm not really trying to be a snide or glib critic because your book can get rejected if you don't put in the stuff that's considered the most important stuff. And it really isn't very satisfying to anyone to just add onto a model that already exists. You really have to remake the model. I don't know. I don't know if I'll succeed. I'm trying it out on you guys. That's
My name's Dorothy Wicker, and my background, I'm retired. My background is physics, and I was interested in that the models, third model that you have on how historical changes happen, and you mentioned the process of emergence, and you did mention moving away from a physics model, and the one that you described sounded to me like classical physics. And what I'm wondering is, are you looking at the links between this process of emergence, where change happens from multiple points, and chaos theory and quantum theory? Because I know that there's work going on in sociology and psychology writing. I think Margaret Wheatley is one that has done quite a bit there, that make that link, and I'm wondering if the link is being made in history books and history textbooks.
I would say I have now seen people, actually the book that I've seen people refer to that I'm also leaning on a little bit is this book called Emergence, which is by Stephen, somebody who I'm not going to... It's got an interesting subtitle like What Ants, Plants, Villages, blah, 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 can all teach us. And I think it does borrow from chaos theory.
Okay.
Really, I feel that most of my fellow historians don't think, even the most brilliant ones, don't think much beyond the model of a kind of hub and spokes, or drop the rock in the water, the ripples go out.
Yeah.
That there are central dynamic modes of change. I've had a colleague say to me, well, women, this is an early American historian. I don't dare tell you who it is, an esteemed historian with an endowed chair at a fine university who said, but women's housework has sort of just stayed the same. That basically women have just been doing the same thing. So that the notion is really that you have a choice between telling a really dynamic story where stuff happens and the kind of grim repetition of daily life. And so part of it is, that's physics, again, I guess, sort of inert states and, dynamic states. And there are huge problems with that, but it's also about, okay, if you only have 20 pages to tell a story about a huge epic of history, do you go with the changes that happen like that? Or do you tell about the changes that happen a little bit more glacially? What makes the better story? Yeah. So there's also an issue of pacing of change too. and again, I don't know if physics can help me with that. I'm certainly open to being helped wherever I can get the help.
There's a lot of. You may want to look at. There's quite a bit out on the concept of the web of life and how it all ties together. If you haven't looked at any of that.
Well, I may tap you after this to get some citations from you. There were some hands over here too. I don't.
Hi, I'm Jessica Williams, and you mentioned that most of the reason that that there was the creolization was so that the women could continue to carry on the cultural development. And given that the majority of current creolizing marriages involve white males and non-white females, but when it's a white male, it's a... Wait, I'm sorry. You know what I mean? The reverse for the other way?
I'm not sure, but keep going.
Okay, I'm sorry. So a white male with a non-white female and then a non-white male with a white female. Do you think that that will eventually lead to a divergence of or a straying from the way that things have been currently going, where since women are responsible for kin work and social development? Does that... I don't know if this is an appropriate question since you're more of a historian and this is kind of a forward-looking thing. But
Yes. Well, let's see. I don't know if I even have anything very intelligent to say about that. I think I probably don't have anything intelligent to say. I would just say that I would not want to say that creolization occurred because women were engaged in cultural survival of some kind. I think people crossed ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious lines for all kinds of strategic reasons, and sometimes because they didn't have a choice. And the consequences, no matter whether it's by choice or not, usually, more often than not, the woman was indigenous. And that does have a huge effect on that subsequent generation's comfort level in both cultures. And they become a political force in almost every place they are. And certainly imperial powers all over the world in different times and places worry about them desperately because they don't know who they're going to be culturally.
Chris Heupel, and I'm a Northwesterner. And I noticed that when you're talking empires, you leave out the Russian Empire of the Northwest, and I didn't know. And I thought, well, maybe you mentioned just Atlantic. So that was the question.
Well, it's a great question. This is something, one of my co-authors is Ellen Du Bois from UCLA, and she always says, Atlantic, Atlantic, Atlantic. Talk to me about the Pacific. And I always say, Ellen, you're doing the 19th century. You can talk about the Pacific. and part of it is that the move that people in my field have made to become less parochial and insular has gone from the original British 13 colonies to actually situating them in the world with which they were completely integrally connected, and to think about the presence of other European powers as well as Native Americans. But it has a very East Coast bias, and it is eastward facing in many ways, and south facing. Even though I talk a lot about the push west, it is East Coast centric in that way of talking about it. I'll just say that's a failing of mine, and it's one I hope I get better at. I mean, part of the interest in this textbook for me is I'm going to learn a lot whether I'm ready for it or not. So hopefully that'll be something that I can figure out how to integrate a little bit better. The little I know, it comes in more at the tail end of my story, or the part I'm writing, but it is an important part of the story. And it's something I've read about, but I haven't really integrated into how I think about it. Eileen.
I'm loud. I may not need one of these. I'm Eileen Finley. I teach Latin American history at American University here in DC. So I guess my question is about emergence and multiple points and meta-narratives. It seems that the genre that like you're shooting for poking a hole in the meta-narrative thing because of, you know, it's what you want to do intellectually and politically, but it's also what you need to do with the textbook. But I guess I'm not clear just from the structure of your talk whether you are poking holes in meta-narratives. It seems that you're trying to come up with new ones, but I don't know if where you're reaching is dispensing with meta-narrative, or even if that's what your project is. Maybe I guess I'm asking to clarify, for you to clarify a little more than you did in the talk.
Yep. Okay, well, this goes back to Eric's comment about being doomed. I think I am doomed both to have to produce a meta-narrative for the textbook and to believe that it is not possible to do what I want to do with the meta-narrative. I haven't given up yet, but I think I am doomed in that way. One of my other co-authors keeps saying, a good story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you got to have people in it. And I keep saying, well, unfortunately, the people who I can flesh out the most are not really the people I want to write about, because those would be the literate people and the powerful people. And, when you're talking about the 16th and the 17th centuries, slave women weren't writing novels in the 17th and 18th centuries. Well, I guess nobody's writing a novel in the 17th century. But anyway, you know what I mean. And so I'm bound to fail, I think, in his eyes, but he's already failed in my eyes because he wrote a chapter draft that didn't have a single woman or person of color in it. And then this goes back to how do you poke holes in it? Unfortunately, your first move is to say, I won't say exactly what I said, but what? You couldn't tie this story in to anyone? He does have Jose Marti in the story, who's a Cuban activist in the United States trying to do some fundraising. So we're going to struggle. We're going to clash. There's going to be a fight. But fights can be very productive. I will have to come up with a narrative, a strong narrative. I will. I'll have to. I'm, staking my claim like the homesteaders I'm going to write about on the homestead, on the household. I think that might be the way I can pull it off. So that's what I'm going to try to do. But, see, in textbooks, you also have to convince your co-authors. You have to all try to sound alike. So I'm also trying to sell the household to them, too, for their parts of it. So we will have a big, strong narrative structure. And I don't know how close that'll get us to what we really think needs to happen. I don't know.
Yeah, just really quickly, I don't know whether the textbook is the intellectual space to really do the bigger intellectual epistemological project that you're talking about. But just even throwing out the question is really great for all of us, right? To think about how we might do it in other venues besides the small case study.
Right. I think we have to try. Because I've never written a textbook before, and so maybe this is where Eric's the voice of wisdom here saying, it's doomed, but I feel like I'm not ready to concede that and say, that's for you guys to write it, and it can't really ever be intellectually satisfying for me or reflect how I think and analyze as a historian. I'm just not ready to give up on that yet.
Oh, thank you. Abraham Avidor, retired from the Foreign Service. As related to your excellent presentation, which was vast in scope, in particular the attitude of men toward women, could you please comment on the observation or remark by Napoleon Bonaparte that in the battlefield of love, a retreat is often the victory? How did that affect this kind of attitude, the formation of household?
Wow, I've never been asked a question like that. So thank you for that. I guess I would say that sounds an awful lot like the kind of emergence I'm talking about. And I was very careful to say some men also don't have the privilege of living lives demarcated by the clear lines of whatever we say about marriage and household in public, because I think it affects, it doesn't fall neatly. That's the whole point of emergence is, in fact, the categories are messy and the rules don't really apply, and there are lots of misfits. So I don't know what to say. If it's true, boy, it would have been one of the only spaces in which Napoleon did retreat, right? I don't know I know other things about Napoleon, but I didn't know that. So thank you for that.
Well, I think, Kathleen, thank you so much for this talk. I think you've convinced us that sex and laundry have a lot to do with a lot of things, and we wish you well in your continuing struggle to show how important this is to U.S. history and really to all kinds of history. And thank you so much for being with us. And please join us outside for more conversation and refreshments.